He says this is a command. Keep on rejoicing. It's not something that you do occasionally, but you just keep at it. And it is something that you can will yourself to do. Now, there's a big difference between rejoicing and being happy. There's a lot of times that I am just not happy. Happiness is the result of the events that happen to us. Now, if you get bitten by a dog, or if your spouse dies, or if you have a car wreck, you're probably not going to be real happy. But rejoicing is different in that rejoicing is a decision of the heart that you make before any event takes place. You're like Paul in the sense that you say, I will rejoice. It is the mind frame that I'm going to be in. Now, I can be rejoicing and not be happy at the same time. As you know, I lost my wife to cancer several years ago, and I can tell you, I was not at all happy about it. But then at the same time, I could rejoice even in something as tragic as that. And the world may not understand it, but that's exactly what Paul tells us to do, and it's what Paul gives us an illustration of in this book. 7 times in this short book, Paul says to rejoice. That is more times per verse than any other book in the Bible. To rejoice is something that we are commanded to do. It's not an optional in any way. So just tell your heart, regardless of what happens, even if I get thrown in prison, even if I get put in chains, if I'm in a shipwreck on the way to Rome, if I had to stand before a crazy, maniacal emperor who absolutely is crazy, I'm still going to rejoice. Now, you may not always be happy about it, but you can rejoice in the process. Now, I have to confess to you that I do not know why Paul put this next phrase in here. He said, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say it, keep on rejoicing. And then verse 5. It must have something to do with rejoicing, but I'm not sure what. He says, let all men know your forbearance. The Lord is at hand. Now, I understand what Paul is saying, but I really do not know what the connection is to rejoicing. And so if any of you have some connection or some understanding of it, I'd appreciate you telling me. But let me share with you what Paul is saying when he says, let men know your forbearance. Now, when we think of forbearance or middle of the road, when forbearance or moderation, we think of just the middle of the road. Not to the left, not to the right, not too hot, not too cold, just moderate. Well, that's just not exactly what is used here. Barclay says that this is one of the most misunderstood words in the Bible, and it's not often used. Paul must have chosen this word very careful when he says, let your forbearance be known to everyone. I guess you could call it something like better than mere justice. Now, this word does not deny justice, but it just goes beyond justice in a better way. It understands justice. It even allows for justice, but it is better than justice, and justice in its strictest sense. Now, what I mean by that is a little complicated. Just bear with me. What every version of the Bible just about translates this word a little different. So let me give you some examples that I have found. Some versions translate it, let people know your patient mind. Let people know your softness, your modesty, your forbearance, your forbearing spirits, your magnanimity. I think probably the one that most, it's a paraphrase, not a version. One man translated it like this in his paraphrase. He said, let people see that you have gotten rid of the sharp edges. Isn't that interesting? Now, if you had lived in Paul's day, the Greeks understood it, obviously, because it was a Greek word, and they would have probably put it something like this, I think. They would have said, let men know your justice and something better than justice. Now, again, I don't know how this is associated with joy, but it must be, because this book is like a symphony, and there is a theme of joy that goes through the whole book, and it keeps getting repeated in different ways. And he puts this in here for some reason. So whatever the association is with our mind and his command to rejoice, it does have something to do with it. But here's the examples from this Bible study. There are 3 times in the book so far that I can find where Paul saw the example of justice, but also of forbearance, when it went beyond justice and it was more than mere justice. The first example of it is when Paul had the preachers who were doing him wrong. You remember that situation? Paul was in chains, and they were preaching Christ, but they were preaching him just to gall him in his chains. Now, justice would have said, all right, somebody stop these guys from doing this. But that's not what Paul did. He said, okay, just let it slide. Don't worry about it. There's a bigger issue here. That's what it means, forbearance. Yes, it acknowledges that they should have stopped, but Paul said, I'm not going to hold it against them. I'm going to allow a little mercy and a little grace to be applied. Now, there's another example in Epaphroditus. You remember Epaphroditus had agreed to go and serve Paul by taking the offering from the Philippians, and then he was going to be there to take care of Paul. It was an incredibly difficult job, and it was probably a dangerous job from beginning to end, and then he gets extremely sick and he almost dies, and Paul says basically, hey, let this guy come back home. Now, yes, he had agreed to come and do this. He said he would do it. He said he would probably even die for Paul if necessary. He would die for the faith. But Paul says, listen, there's some extenuating circumstances here. We need to let this guy come home. Justice would have said Epaphroditus had to stay there with him and stick it out. But Paul was a little more forbearing than that. And Paul said, let him come home and honor him for the work that he has done. But then the greatest example of this forbearance is in the example of God sending His Son to us. Hey, you all know as well as I do, we have nothing to offer Him. All we have is a bag full of banana peels and eggshells. Nothing of any value whatsoever. We deserve to die and go to hell. Period. And yet God sent His Son and said, I understand the need for justice, but I'll be forbearing with these people, and I will let my Son die in their place. Now again, I don't know how to tell you to connect this rejoice in the Lord always. But for some reason, Paul said, rejoice in the Lord always, and then he said, let all men know your forbearance. And it may be just as simple as this. If you apply the grace to other people, the forbearance, if you take the rough edges off of yourself and don't always demand strict justice and allow other people a little mercy, you may find that you have a little more joy in your life. Maybe it's that simple. I can tell you it definitely would be worth a try. Try it and then let me know how it turns out. I think I'm going to. Now, the next thing that Paul says about our heart, and this is a matter of the heart, I think, he says, have no anxiety about anything. Now, my personality is very different from Nathan's personality, which is very different from your personality. We're all different. Nathan, fortunately, got his mother's personality more than me. He's a little more laid back than I am. I'm a bit hyper. Nathan's always fussing at me and saying, Dad, don't worry about it. Take it easy. You know, you're getting all upset for nothing. Well, that's just my personality. I have to struggle with that. And I can tell you, I do not always have no anxiety about anything. But I have some questions about it too. And I was trying to figure out a way to say this, and I think I know what it means, but I can tell you I have a real hard time putting it into practice. You see, this idea of anxiety doesn't mean don't have any concern for someone. In fact, we must be moved with compassion for other people. Should we not have any concern for the lost? Should we not have any concern for sick people who are in the hospital? Should we not have any concern for them? Of course we should. But at the same time, we're not supposed to be anxious for anything. And I think this is the distinction between legitimate concern from someone. In fact, in a few minutes we'll see that Paul said the Philippians had concern for him and he was grateful for it. The difference between the concern and the anxiety is two things. First of all, when we are anxious about something, it's about something that we have no control over whatsoever. we don't know when or how we are going to die. And the fact is, we probably don't have very much control over it. Now, we may think we do by eating the good diet and all that kind of thing. It's like the story I heard of this couple that had lived together, and they'd been married like 70 years, and finally they both died within a few weeks of each other, and they got to heaven, and they were old people. They were in their 90s, and they got to heaven and saw the wonderfulness of heaven, and the first day they were walking around holding hands, and the next day he wasn't holding hands with her anymore. And the third day he wasn't even walking on the same side of the street with her. And the fourth day he didn't even see her. So his wife came to him and said, "What's the matter, honey? We've been married for 70 years, and we get up here and all of a sudden you don't even see me." He looked at her and he said, "If you hadn't fed me all that oatmeal and vitamins, I could have been here 20 years ago." Now, we may think oatmeal and vitamins are going to keep us from dying, but in reality, we have no control over that. There's very little that we can do about when we're going to die or how we're going to die. So it would just be pure anxiety to be worried about that kind of thing. So if we can't control it, we ought not be anxious over it. And then it also pertains to our selfish desires. Jesus in Matthew the 6th chapter, the 25th verse, said, don't be anxious, and he uses the same word. And all the things that he mentions about not being anxious over are things for our personal self. What you're going to eat, what you're going to wear. Yes, I think there is a Christian concern for me to make sure I have food for my family and to be concerned that they are clothed and sheltered. But I do not need to be anxious over my personal well-being. That's selfishness to do that. And that is absolutely contrary to everything that Paul has said about our relationships in the book of Philippians. So we should have concern for the sick. We should have concern for the hurting. We should have concern for the lost. And we should be moved with compassion. Our hearts literally should ache. That's what that word compassion is. It's when you hurt inside because you see somebody else hurting. But we should not be concerned for the selfish things of life. And we should not be concerned for those things that we have no control over. That's just anxiety. It's not going to help anything at all. Now, instead of having anxiousness and anxiety in your heart, you need to pray for everything. Now, you can even pray for things that are not in your control. In fact, it's an especially good idea to pray for things that are not in your control. And you can pray for things that are in your control. And you can pray even for personal things that you would desire. And allow God to answer you yes, no, maybe, wait, and all the other ways that he sometimes answers us. And our prayers can be general, and they can be specific. They can be prayers, they can be supplications. We can beg God over and over for it. Remember, I told you at the beginning of this that God is loving enough that he wants you as a child, and he's powerful enough to make you his child. And if he is loving, he would be glad to hear from us. And since he is powerful, he will be glad to give us what is best for us. So instead of being anxious, pray for it. And he also says, pray for it with thanks for whatever and however it turns out.